Welcome to the Mind Vine podcast, where we challenge the stigma associated with mental illness through conversations about a variety of issues impacting mental health. Here we bring you news, views, and interviews that intrigue, educate, and celebrate recovery. Leading us on this journey are the hosts of the Mind Vine podcast, Darryl Mathers and Chris Bovie.
So welcome to the Mind Vine podcast. This is episode 7. Wow. I can't believe we made it this far. My mom watching these videos is
Number
really
6 was, we hit that one out of the park.
Yeah, we did. We had the Stellas, and we've got a couple other ones coming up pretty
soon.
soon.
We sustain? That's the question. Can we sustain?
No, we cannot. It's over.
We'll try.
We're going to.
All right.
We should just wrap it up. But we're not going to do that. We actually have a pretty exciting day today. It's kind of a forensic mental health day. Mm-hmm. We have a couple of guests. One is a patient, Brian, Brian Rose. We have kind of developed a relationship over the last couple of years. Brian's story, I'm just going to give the Coles Notes version. So Brian is from a place, southwestern Ontario, called Delhi, which is just south of Brantford. It's in Norfolk County. And he came to Ontario Shores via the forensic mental health system. So despite being quite ill in his adolescent years, abusing substances, he ran into a bit of trouble. Didn't get the help he needed. Unfortunately, resulted in the death of his grandmother. He was found not criminally responsible. It was about 4.5 years ago now. So he spent a couple years in jail. He went to Waypoint, which is one of our partner specialty mental health hospitals. And then about 2 years ago, he came here. And I've worked closely with him, but you know him too.
He's a great guy.
Yeah, he's a great guy. And he's worked tremendously hard on his recovery.
Mm-hmm. And forensics has always been a tough one for us to discuss. It's always been sort of it can be sensitive. There's a lot of dynamics to, in this case, with family and how people see, or believe his path should go, where he should be. And I think it's good having these conversations. I think we were always afraid to have them in the past, but I think, when you look at the forensic mental health system and the success it has, and we talk about statistics all the time, but the recidivism rate for someone going through forensic mental health is like 10 to 13, 14%, where criminal justice system's 44%. Mm-hmm. So it does have success. And I think, it's hard for people just to kind of understand that these people are ill, and through help, they can lead very productive lives. Yeah. And if you go to, and I always say, like, people react to these types of things after the fact. But if you look at each of these cases, you can go back and say, we missed it. We can go back in the history and say, if we only got to these people, we could have prevented these things. And I almost feel like it's a systemic failure more than the failure of the individual.
Yeah, and specifically in Brian's case, there's 2 incidents, but there's several instances where sorry,
you're going to turn your phone
on. Yeah. It's a new phone. The notifications have a mind of their own. I've kept trying to corral it, but it's not working. So it may go off repeatedly at any time.
That was the warning for you to stop talking.
But in Brian's case, when he was going through his criminal proceeding and eventually adjudicated NCR, there was a couple incidences that he clearly slipped through the cracks, right, where he was delusional and he was arrested and released. There was one time where he was released from hospital and he walked barefoot, I think it was for 2 hours in a bush on his way home. Like, there were signs, and he, to his credit, he's not here speaking publicly to point fingers at police or acute care hospitals. He sincerely wants to see a change, mm-hmm, and he's been working hard not only on his recovery, which has led to him being discharged into the community, but he speaks publicly for events that we host. Yep. Him and I are actually presenting at the Ontario Hospital Association conference next month. He is dedicating this kind of next phase of his life to helping make a difference in mental health.
Right, that's great.
And so we're going to have the opportunity to sit down and talk to him. One of the great things he's doing which I think is very brave, and you don't see a lot of it with patients in general, especially forensic mental health patients, is he is going back to his community. We actually went there in the summer, and we spent today talking to a reporter, somebody that I used to work with. I used to live in that area. And just telling his story and giving people an update on his recovery, that he was found NCR, and that's not where Brian's story ended. And he's pretty brave, because regardless of how how proud we are of him, people won't understand. People will think he still belongs in jail, and but I think it's a pretty bold step that he's making.
It is, and I mean it's hard for someone to be able to, especially you mentioned it's a small community, to say that, and there are people that aren't going to react well to it, but I think as long as we keep having the conversation, that's the only way we're going to change things. And like we said, there's a lot of people that do understand and support, and you've got to focus on that. There's people you'll never change their minds, right? They're kind of won't see it any other way, but we have to have this conversation. We were always kind of, again, afraid to talk about it because it's a tough conversation at times. But, for us, it's something that we provide. It's a service we provide, and we have great stories of recovery and people doing great things, and we need to be able to share those.
Yeah, and it's great. There's
Are
my
you
phone
going
again. It won't be the last time you hear it, but and it's great to have that other perspective. Have a reporter, Daniel R. Pearce from the Simcoe Reformer, which is part of the Post Media Group. So Brian's story, when it is published, which is hopefully next month, it will appear in all sorts of papers in, at the very least, southwestern Ontario. And it's going to be great to have Dan here to kind of see what he's experienced in trying to tell Brian's story. He's been working on it for months. I know there's my phone again.
Can we fire Darryl?
Yeah, it's a fireable offense.
It could be.
Having your phone on during a podcast.
I'm trying to be patient, but
it's adding levity, if nothing else. Yeah. But it's going to be great to have Dan here to offer that kind of unique perspective of. He actually covered the trial that led to Brian being found NCR, and he's firmly entrenched in the community where Brian lives and has a kind of his finger on the pulse of how the community might react to Brian's story.
And kudos to him, because often the story doesn't get told, right? It's usually sort of the very surface. It's the court. It's the police brief. It's the headline. And in most cases where we see stories about mental illness, the voice of the person with the illness is never told, and that's unfortunate. We never have that side of it to properly understand. It's usually just very surface sort of journalism for a lot of reasons, right? They can be sensational. They don't have the resources, but for Dan to do this story and get dig a little deeper is great.
Yeah, I can't wait. I can't wait to talk to both of them, and I can't wait for the story to come out. Even though my expectations are tempered, not only because it's not going to be strictly Brian's story. I mean, it has to be balanced. Yeah, it's got to be fair, and hopefully it's objective. But hopefully it can provide a voice, like you said, that very seldom gets one.
Right.
And so I think what Brian's doing is commendable. So. We're happy to have Brian and Dan on the podcast, so hope you guys enjoy these interviews. So we're happy to have Brian with us today, joining the podcast. Brian, welcome, first of all.
Thank you.
And personally, I take a lot of pride in having Brian on. We've done a lot of work together, and you've shared your story here at Ontario Shores many times. You've blogged for us. We're going to be doing something at a conference for the Ontario Hospital Association next month, and we're here actually working on something with a reporter from your hometown. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. Like what are you doing with Dan from the Simcoe Reformer?
We're just talking about my recovery journey and trying to open up the movement of mental health awareness in my community. I'd like to see people more educated and understanding about what happened, and trying to see more resources come into effect.
And where you're from, I'm familiar with. I used to work there many years ago, actually with the reporter that you're talking to today. And it's a small community, and the tragedy with you and your grandmother and your illness, it was big news, and probably divided a community in some respects. Like, how do you kind of balance the fact that maybe people aren't ready to hear what you have to say?
You just have to be open and understanding that people do have their opinions, and you have to understand where they're coming from. I come from a very conservative community in Delhi. It's a working farming community, and I understand where they're coming from. I just think you have to be open-minded about the whole situation. It was a tragedy, and it was very hard for some people to understand. But hopefully in time, with the mental health movement, people will be more understanding.
And how did you feel? I mean, before you first sort of told your story, I mean, there had to be a lot of anxiety and worry about that. What was the realization once you actually told the story compared to what you thought might happen before you did it?
Sorry, what was the question?
Well, just were you fearful of, okay, if I tell the story, this is going to happen? And did you find it to actually be more positive, actually, once you actually told your story?
Yeah, I was a little bit afraid at the time. I thought it was going to be very negative and stuff. But the way Dan, the reporter, has been interviewing me and stuff, it's more hopeful, and it's about the movement. It's about trying to understand and trying to make people more aware of mental health diagnoses.
Mm-hmm. Right.
When you're telling your story in the community, you were actually just telling me about in your training last week that you're training to be a peer support specialist. That's what you want to do. You want to give back to people who are struggling and living with mental illness. And you kind of waited to tell your story to kind of open up with all the details, and then the reaction you got was pretty remarkable.
It was overwhelming. I took a OPDI training, and one of the facilitators there was actually from Port Dover, right around where I grew up. And I waited till the 5th day of training. It was a 5-day training. And I actually talked to the staff at OPDI whether I should tell it or not. And they said, it's up to you. And so the 5th day, I finally opened up and told my story, and people were overwhelmed. And four of the peers that I was taking the course with actually came up and gave me a hug. So it was very nice.
The support that we just experienced it here, the support that you've gotten at Ontario Shores, I think you talk about quite often. Your recovery started once you were found not criminally responsible. You went to Waypoint, and then you came here. And you've really built a lot of relationships with patients and staff here. What's that support meant to you?
It's really it's awesome. It's overwhelming, to have that family here, because my family growing up, it was very I don't know the right word, but dysfunctional. There's a lot of alcoholism and abuse going on. To have a healthy family here of patients and staff that are just growing is remarkable. I love it here. This is where I want to be, and I think a career in peer support would be an excellent avenue for me to go through.
And it seems to be, we found it in telling patient stories that, often people can get caught up, with your story, the headline behind, they don't see people as people. And when you get to meet someone like Brian, or get to see your story and get to listen to you, it personalizes things. And I think more people that hear about you as a human being, it sort of tears away that stigma or that perception. Because I think a lot of people in a case like that, they can't relate. Mm-hmm. They don't understand, because unless it's impacted them, they don't understand mental illness.
Yes, and I'm diagnosed with schizophrenia, which is a heavy diagnosis. I find people understand anxiety and maybe depression, but when it comes to bipolar and schizophrenia, people don't want to deal with it. The fact that you could have auditory hallucinations, right. People don't want to deal with that, and the whole tragedy of the whole thing is falling through the system, the cracks of the system. It's a tough situation, but I am a person, and I have a lot of love in me, and I'm not what I did. I'm Brian. I've lived a decent life. I went to university. I worked hard my whole life, and it's just something that happened. Like, mental illness took over my life, and there wasn't a lot of help. But I'm hoping to change things with sharing my story.
And we talk about that, and it's unique to mental illness, right? We talk about the more ill you get with cancer, for example, the more empathy and understanding people have. Mental illness is the opposite. People can get Bell Let's Talk and adolescent mental health and anxiety, but the more ill, the less people want anything to do with that. And it's unique. I can't think of any other illness where the more ill you get, the more people pull away.
Brian and I kind of joke that, because we both grew up in small communities, somebody gets sick, they fall ill, whether it's cancer or another critical illness, people are coming over and saying, can I help with the kids? Yeah. Here's a lasagna, right? Yeah. When you're diagnosed with schizophrenia, nobody was bringing lasagnas to the farm, right?
Yeah. Like, I'm still waiting for my lasagna.
That stuff doesn't happen, right? Like, and even though it's a life-threatening illness, it's something that, it's a critical illness, and people just, we're not there yet. But I'm sure, even in your time here in the last couple of years, as you kind of transition into being an advocate for people living with mental illness, you probably noticed a bit of a shift positively towards people's attitudes around mental health.
Yeah, things are changing. I hope to see a paradigm in the whole mental health movement. I hope people can see it like acute illness.
Mm-hmm.
Well, just a couple more things before we let you go. There's just, what you're doing with Dan and your hometown paper, I think, is incredibly brave. It's you're putting it out there. You're being honest. People, how people receive it, we'll see, right? Like hopefully at the end of the day, some people or percentage of people see that the effort you've made. What are you hopeful of realistically of what the article back in your hometown might do to people's perception?
I'm hoping to see a little bit of compassion and understanding. I know there will be a few that will not like to hear that I'm doing well, but I hope there is compassion with a lot of people that maybe are sitting on the fence.
Right.
And the one thing I always be cognizant of, and we're in the media and we do a lot of social media, is sometimes it can bring out the worst people or the worst in people. So sometimes the commentary that you hear isn't necessarily representative of how everybody feels. So even if there's negative comments, to know there's a lot of people that support you that may not be out there saying things, but behind the scenes really have compassion for you. And I just want to add, from your perspective too, to kind of ask, how's it been for your kind of mental wellness to be able to tell your story now? Does it feel like a weight's been lifted, that you're able to freely talk about this and not sort of internalize it?
Yes, definitely. I feel as if it's the right thing to do in my grandmother's memory. Her name's not in vain when I'm sober and sharing my story and living a life that's a life she'd want me to live. It's a very upsetting topic for me, but because I loved her. I really loved my grandmother, and it's just, when I think about it, it's just very upsetting to me, but at least we're moving forward, and I have a lot of love and support from here in Ontario Shores, and also I have an excellent mother. Like, my mother I put her through hell, and she's stuck behind me, and she's there for me, and I love her to pieces. And at the end of the day, that's who really matters to me, is my mom.
This will be the last thing I ask you. But you've recently been discharged from the hospital. You're now what we consider to be an outpatient, so you're still receiving support. But you've got an apartment, and you've got some of the freedoms back that you've been waiting 6.5 years for. And I wonder if you could tell people, because people hear that, right? They associate you with the tragedy of your grandmother's death, and then all of a sudden, to them, it might feel like, oh, you're out, right? Even though we know that's not the truth. Can you give, just since your time here or your time in the mental health system, so when you went to Waypoint to when you got here, give people an idea of the work that you've had to put into your own recovery.
I had to put in a lot of work. a lot of times you don't have to public speak. You don't have to do anything. You can just lay in your bed every day. But I got up every morning and worked hard physically and mentally. And I took groups, programming, public speaking, podcasting, doing everything I can just to make a difference in the world. My journey has been hard, and I never want to go back there. So I'm making sure I'm on my meds. I made sure I wasn't in any conflict, any fights. I made in all my check-ins, doing everything I had to do to move through the system. And it's hard at times, but I'm finally here.
Well, great. Nobody's more proud of you than the communications department on Ontario Shores. And you've done a lot of work for us, and we appreciate you taking time today, and all the best.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brian. So we're pleased to have, from the Simcoe Reformer, a place I used to work actually, Daniel R. Pearce. We're going to call him Dan for the benefit of the podcast, but he's a reporter who's been working with one of our patients on a story back in his home community. So thanks for joining us, Dan.
Well, thanks for having me, guys. Yeah.
And feel free to share any stories that you've heard in the past of him at the Reformer.
There are probably not too many, but I hope anyways. So you're here today. We've done a few things with Brian. It's the second time you're interviewed. You've been working on a piece which I assume is bigger than just Brian, maybe mental health as a whole in your community. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the journey you've been on since we first kind of connected back in July?
Yeah, well, since I met Brian in the park and we had that talk, I've been out trying to talk to other experts, and you continue to hear the same thing that Brian says about the need for more resources and more understanding and more preventative programming out there for people with mental health issues, and so you don't end up in a situation where somebody's committing a serious crime.
Sorry about that. Maybe for the benefit of our audience, assuming we have one at this point.
We do.
But can you give people a sense of the community that you and Brian are from, and how big of a story this tragedy was in the community at that time?
Well, it was a massive story. Anytime you get and again, it's very sensational. Let's be honest. It's a very sensational story. It's big headlines, and people are following it. And there was a provincial and national following for this story, to be honest. The story, I covered, to clarify for the audience here, I covered this issue right from day one. I was there at the farm the day of, and I covered the trial, and I was there for almost every single one of Brian's court appearances. So this case has a very high profile, and it's only fitting to have this kind of follow-up, because it had a big profile 3-4 years ago. Well, here's the follow-up to that.
And thank you very much for doing the follow-up. I think we all worked in the media, and I think it's easy to kind of cover something after, but you rarely see people go back and look at the lead-up, right? There's a tragedy happen or something happen. And again, resources and all the things that are really hard to do. But there's such a story before that, right? How did that happen? What failed? What are the things that led up to that, to properly understand the context of an event?
Yeah. Well, certainly during the trial, there was lots and lots of evidence of how Brian and his family, had sought out help and couldn't get it. And then there was a famous incident where Brian was waving a pickaxe out on the road, and he was actually in a hospital for a while, and they let him out, and then he committed the violent act.
Right.
And the question is, where did we fail as a system here?
Going back to that time when you're covering the trial, and the time up to when we met in the park in July, what was the difference you saw just in Brian physically from the time that he was making that initial few court appearances to where he was in a much healthier place in life?
Well, it's something I've thought about actually, because those very initial court appearances, Brian was a different person than you see today. He had my recollection is he had long, scraggly hair and a beard, and was sort of looking around the room, and it was clearly somebody who maybe had some mental health issues going on. And then as the trial progressed, he became this cleaned up, slim, young man wearing a suit and acknowledging everybody in the courtroom. And then, of course, meeting him today and meeting him this summer, very articulate person. And, a total change from that. First time I ever saw him I think it must have been in bail court. And compared to who he is today, is two totally different people.
How do you feel that, that this story will be received when it does come out from your community?
I know it's a very conservative community, and you know that because you lived there for a while and worked with us there in Simcoe. I think you'll see a mixed reaction. Some people have already told me they think that this isn't right. They think Brian should be in jail, should never get out. It's still a murder, blah, blah, blah. But there is a movement afoot in our community in Norfolk County for better mental health. There are people who are advocating for that, and they are gaining traction, and we do have some mental health services available, and it's growing. That awareness is growing, and I think people are coming to accept it, and I think a lot of people will accept, the article.
And I think it's hard for people to. I mean, everybody wants to put their lens. If something happens, well, they want to understand it, and I think where we run into trouble with these types of sentinel events is people like, how did he not know what he was doing, right? Or how could someone, because they can't mentally think of that place where someone was so ill that they would do something like that, and they want to sort of wrap it up in a neat box to understand it. But how do we, through the media, how do we do a better job of helping people sort of understand the complexity of mental illness? Is there something that, and again, I don't want to put everything on the media.
Yes,
I think
it's Stan's responsibility.
No, but, we've had talks about, and different media outlets, like your paper is going to be totally different than the Toronto Sun. And we all know, there's different, I don't, we came from the media, and I have I didn't know half what I knew as someone in the media as they do now. And how do we maybe collectively do a better job to support media to better understand the complexities of these issues?
It's a big question, but it's a matter of building those relationships, right? Like even what we're doing here today, I've made contacts here. I have some background information. There's people I can call as well, and maybe mental health people have to do sort of some upfront work where they make contact with editors and reporters ahead of time before something like this happens, so they know who to call and have some background information about the issues.
Yeah, I think it lies with us. In the past when I came here, people would see something and they'd claim stigma, and I'm like, well, I think most reporters, and they want to do a good story. They want to do the right thing. They want to cover it properly. But they're asked to do so many things in today's age. Like, the person that might be covering courts might be covering municipal politics and sports and everything. And it's not easy to somehow pick up and understand the NCR or the forensic or the Ontario Review Board and I think we have to do a better job of supporting the media and understanding.
That's probably a good idea. And you do have an understanding of how the media works today. I mean, when Darryl, when you worked with us, we had like 8 reporters in our newsroom, and now we have 3. And that's very standard across all newsrooms in North America. And that means less resources. You have to focus your resources a little bit more carefully. And fortunately, my editors made it available for me to come here and be able to put time into this.
Yeah, that's great.
You mentioned when we were talking earlier today and via email that you have a lot of experience covering in the courts, covering news in the courts, and also with the mental health piece. Have you seen kind of an evolution in mental health in the courts in your time covering, or what kind of stands out in the years of being a reporter in the court system?
Yeah, well, I've covered quite a bit of court. I don't get there as often as I used to, and I see a lot of different types of court stories. Yeah, you can have a big murder or whatever. You can have a shoplifting charge and somebody is in front of a judge on a shoplifting or drinking and driving. But what's interesting is that this theme keeps coming out again and again of mental illness, or and maybe they're not declared NCR, but it's still a mental health issue where people have a lapse of judgment and they do something really stupid. And sometimes people say, you know, when I did something really stupid, I'm going to plead guilty and get some, you know, counseling and pay a fine and then move on with my life or whatever the case, you know, may be. But I think, you know, defense lawyers more and more start talking about mental health and crime as well. And the number batted around is something like 20 to 25% of all crimes have a mental health issue underneath. Maybe it's more than that. And then if you look at the provincial jail system, our provincial jail system is terrible, and through no fault of the people running the jails, they don't have the resources. And so people who have mental health issues will get arrested and convicted, and they're put into a terrible jail, or they're just staring at a wall with other people who are maybe in the same situation they are in. So we definitely need to do, we need more resources. That's what I see. All the time. You talk about what has changed in the court. More and more, when you go into bail court in Simcoe every day, there'll be someone from CMHA, Canadian Mental Health Association. There's one or two women who are always in there no matter what. And I know them and they know me, and they'll say, "Who are you here for?" And I'll tell them, and I'll say to them, "Who are you here for?" And they'll say, "Well, nobody in particular, but you know, one of our clients will be here today." You know,
Right.
And more often than not, they are.
Yeah, and I think there's a perception in the community, and I kind of wanted to address that too. Is, you know, I think people think, you know, not criminally responsible is a way, you know, people use it. They see it on TV as, you know, a way to get out of jail, and I know that I think 0.001% of cases or criminal cases are adjudicated NCR, so it's a very rare process that it happens. But there's that feeling. But the reality is, you know, for a lot of people, for minor crimes, and most people in the forensic system have committed minor offenses, but it's probably quicker to go through the jail system, right, than it is to go through the mental health system where you're attached for a very long
It's
time.
interesting you say that. I didn't really want to bring that, but I've seen a few cases where I felt the person was clearly NCR and they were their own best witness. But their defense lawyer wouldn't go that route because, you know, you've already spent a couple years or maybe a year in jail waiting for this big trial. You're getting a 2-for-1 credit. And then in the federal penitentiary system, there's kind of a 2/3 release. You start doing the math on a manslaughter conviction, and you're actually better off to, you know, plead guilty to a serious crime in some cases, because with NCR, you may never get out. There's no guarantee that you will get out.
So from a time, it's better off from a time perspective, but the problem is, you know, once somebody's done serving, they're going out without any supports, and they're just going to be in this cycle because there's nothing there to support them. They're not getting any better. Right?
Yeah, the question is their mental illness recognized when they get into the penitentiary system? And what kind of help is offered? I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't have those answers.
I would say Brian would probably say no, from my experience in talking to him. Like,
as far as the
you know, when
support.
you're like, you know, and looking at his particular case, waiting to be adjudicated NCR. You know, I think his situation, I mean, he would speak better to it than I could, but he wasn't getting the support he needed. It wasn't until they got the NCR verdict that his recovery could begin.
That's correct. And you know, if I recall correctly, the charge was first-degree murder. And in Canada, if you're convicted of first-degree murder, there's no tempering around with where you're going to go. You're just sent right away to the bad penitentiary, and it's assumed that you've committed the worst crime possible, and now you're going to be punished. And so think of that. You know. You're really rolling the dice. If you don't get that NCR, then you're really lost.
Wrapping up here, just one last thing. Being so familiar with this case and Brian and what it went to your community and, like you said, even provincially and nationally, what's this process been like for you? Getting to know Brian again, or and making those calls, like what's that experience been like?
Well, it's been really interesting. I've learned a lot from it, and being a person who has covered a lot of court, it's sort of rounded out that experience. Covering the trial, we were talking about that earlier today. It was very draining. When you cover a trial, it's almost like you're part of it, and it's emotionally exhausting, mentally draining. You know, and it's kind of strange for me because I feel like I know Brian now. I've been through all this and I've interviewed him, and it's like I'm reporting on somebody I know. You know, it's not just an other out there.
Well, thank you very much for coming today to meet Brian again and tour our facility, and for being on our podcast. We appreciate it greatly.
Well, thanks for having me.
All right.
Hey.
Yeah. We're number 1 in Norfolk County.